A soft drizzle clung to the wooden beams of the abandoned homestead when the sheriff's men forced open the cellar door. Their lanterns flickered against the damp stone, revealing what the April sun had never touched. A row of ceramic jars, sealed with brittle wax, each one carefully labeled in a trembling feminine hand. The air was thick with the scent of mold and iron. One of the deputies, young, inexperienced, and still believing the world had rules, lifted the lid from the nearest jar. Inside was a pale residue, faintly blue, crystalline at the bottom. Arsenic, though they would not know that until much later. By then, 3 bodies had already been buried, 2 more convulsing in the sickbed, and rumors had begun threading their way through the town like skeletal fingers searching for the living. But it was the letter found beneath those jars that froze even the seasoned sheriff. Folded into a tight square, stained at one corner as though clutched by a shaking hand, it bore 6 words. I was never meant to live. No signature, no date, only the faint impression of a teardrop, long dried. In the weeks that followed, townsfolk spoke of curses, of a marriage forced by cruelty, of a girl sold into a home that fed on her obedience and silence. A girl who had walked down an aisle with her head bowed, married to the son of the man who had owned her. A girl who had smiled on command, and a family that had dined together the night they began to die. Before we continue with the story of the girl they once called the Virgin Slave, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The year was 1871, and America wore its wounds openly. The Civil War had ended 6 years earlier, but the countryside bore scars deeper than the craters left on its battlefields. Reconstruction had turned cities into battlegrounds of law, power, and vengeance. In the rural counties of the Mississippi River Delta, feverish summer heat clung to the cotton fields, and men still whispered about the night riders who stalked the roads, their faces covered, their torches bright. Freedmen struggled to carve out survival in a land that refused to let go of its chains, and former slaveholders, robbed of the old order, clung desperately to the remnants of their dominion. The town of Fairwater sat at the edge of these tensions, a cluster of wooden storefronts hugged by farmland and forest. Its church bell tolled each dawn, calling farmers from their cramped beds to prayer before the fields swallowed them whole. Horses snorted in the muddy streets. Women bartered over salt pork and dyed cloth under the awning of the mercantile. And the gossip, always the gossip, flowed like a river without end, carrying secrets from doorstep to doorstep. Thick humidity coated everything, turning the air itself into something you could almost chew. On summer nights, cicadas droned in a ceaseless choir, while kerosene lamps cast yellow halos on porches where families gathered, pretending peace had returned. The smell of cane syrup, hot earth, and animal sweat drifted through narrow alleys. Fairwater was a place that wished to appear ordinary, but the cracks beneath the surface were visible even to travelers who passed through on horseback. The social order was shifting, though the old families resisted the change with clenched fists. Men who had once commanded plantations now tried to govern their homes with a quieter, more insidious iron hand. There were houses where freedom existed only on paper. The law was a patchwork, some counties enforcing federal mandates, others ignoring them outright. In that uneasy space, many young black women lived in a shadowed realm between enslavement and servitude, tolerated but never valued, seen but never acknowledged. The home at the edge of Fairwater, the Dunn property, stood as a perfect symbol of that unresolved era. Built in the 1840s, its white columns looked worn and tired, streaked with patches of mildew, like a once proud creature struggling to hide its decay. Inside, the air smelled faintly of camphor and roses, a fragrance the lady of the house adored, though it never fully disguised the scent of old wood soaked with decades of sweat and sorrow. Life moved slowly in Fairwater, governed by the church calendar, the harvest cycle, and the moods of powerful men. Newspapers arrived once a week from Jackson, carrying stories of political infighting, racial violence, and promises of reform. At the post office, folks gathered to listen as the clerk read aloud the most shocking headlines while sorting mail with ink-stained fingers. The town knew of change, but experienced little of it. On the evening before the Dunn family fell ill, the sky had been unusually quiet. No wind stirred the tall grass. The moon, half-shrouded, cast pale light on the fields where workers had long since returned to their shacks, too exhausted to speak. A single lantern glowed in the Dunn kitchen, its flame trembling behind the window pane as a young woman moved through the room in near silence. She was small, barely 20, with hair like ink and eyes that carried the weight of something unsaid. Neighbors who had caught glimpses of her described her as a ghost in daylight, because she walked with the quiet assurance of someone who had learned to survive without drawing notice. Some said she rarely spoke unless spoken to. Others claimed she kept her mouth shut because she knew it was safer that way. The truth was more complicated and far darker. Her presence in the Dunn household was the subject of whispered speculation, though no one would admit it aloud. The Dunns insisted she was, like family, taken in out of charity after the war, but the way she lowered her gaze around Mr. Dunn, the way she stiffened when the sun entered the room, these things betrayed a different reality, one the town preferred not to acknowledge. As Reconstruction laws spread through the South, families like the Dunns found subtler ways to maintain control. Employment contracts, guardianships, arrangements that looked proper on paper but echoed the bondage of years before. Many girls disappeared into such households, their stories lost to dust in ledger books. But this girl, this young woman the Dunns would later call ungrateful, wicked, ungodly, would not vanish quietly. Fairwater had no shortage of tragedies, but none had prepared it for the events of that April. In a matter of days, the Dunn estate transformed from a symbol of stubborn tradition into a place marked by death, secrecy, and fear. The sheriff's office, a squat wooden building with a rusting iron stove, became the center of frantic activity. Doctors carried black bags filled with tinctures that did nothing. Neighbors gathered outside the gate, clutching rosaries and muttering prayers, and the girl at the heart of it all kept her silence. She had been a child when the war ended, barely old enough to understand the meaning of freedom. By the time she grew into womanhood, the idea of liberty had become a story other people lived. She knew the smell of lye soap and blood, the texture of bruised skin hidden beneath sleeves, the quiet terror of a world where your life belonged to someone else. And she knew something the Dunns never imagined she would learn: how easily a body could be undone by what it consumed. The Dunn farm was a place of rigid order. Animals fed before sunrise, women working the kitchen by mid-morning, Mr. Dunn's boots clicking across the porch like a metronome marking each hour. The town saw the family as upright, prosperous, church-going, but the girl saw what others did not: the fractures, the lies, the cruelty disguised beneath civility. She had spent years watching, waiting, enduring. And in that cellar, beneath the jars filled with a powder that could steal breath from lungs and life from limbs, investigators would later find another object: a broken rosary. Its beads scattered, its cross snapped cleanly in half. Some claimed it was a sign of a soul at war with itself. Others believed it belonged to one of the victims, dropped in a moment of agony. But a few, those who whispered behind closed doors, said the rosary marked the moment the girl stopped praying for deliverance and decided to claim it herself. Fairwater would never forget the Dunn tragedy, and it would never again look at quiet young women the same way. The Dunn family had always carried themselves with the self-assurance of people who believed the world orbited neatly around their table, and perhaps for a time, it did. Their home stood on the tallest rise near Fairwater, 3 miles from town, where the field sloped into a shallow valley lined with willow trees that whispered in every passing breeze. From a distance, the place looked noble, almost serene. Up close, it felt like a house built on unspoken rules and weighted silence. The patriarch, Silas Dunn, was a man carved from stern lines and rigid habits. In his youth, he had been known for riding stallions that no one else dared break. By middle age, his dark hair had thinned and turned wiry, streaked with premature gray. Yet he still carried himself like a man who expected obedience as naturally as breath. His face was long, with a blade-sharp jaw and deep creases etched across his brow from years of scowling at the world he believed had wronged him. Reconstruction frustrated him. Freedom angered him. His diminished plantation, once vast, now reduced, embittered him. Neighbors described him with a careful neutrality that spoke louder than judgment. "He's a man of discipline," they'd say, or "Mr. Dunn is particular." In private, they used different words: unyielding, unpredictable, dangerous. Inside the Dunn home, his voice was rarely raised, but it struck with lethal precision when it did. One of the surviving servants recounted in later years how the air changed when his boots hit the floorboards. Even the house dogs, she said, lowered their heads when he entered a room. Late one evening, only a month before tragedy struck, Silas was overheard speaking to the pastor on his porch after Sunday service. The lantern light carved shadows across his face as he leaned in and muttered, "The Lord gave us order, Reverend. Order must be kept. A house without order is a house inviting rot." The Reverend, taken aback, had responded gently, "Silas, God's order is not the same as man's. Sometimes grace must find its place too." Silas's reply had been a soft, eerily calm whisper. "Grace," he said, "is for people who deserve it." His son, Nathaniel Dunn, was 24. Handsome in a way that made the town's young women glance twice, but look away quickly, as though they sensed something poisonous beneath the surface. Nathaniel's hair was a lighter shade than his father's, the color of sun-struck wheat, and his blue eyes could appear tender in moments of charm. But charm was a costume he wore selectively. Most days he seemed restless, moving through the world like a man burdened by expectations he could not meet. He had returned from a brief stint in a militia group that disbanded after federal troops cracked down on illicit gatherings. Some whispered that Nathaniel had taken part in night rides during those early years of Reconstruction, though no accusation ever reached a courtroom. The local barber once overheard Nathaniel say to a friend, "There ain't no justice left for our kind, so a man takes what he can, where he can." Nathaniel's temperament wavered. Amiable one day, volatile the next. Beneath his charismatic exterior lived a simmering resentment, the same bitterness that ruled Silas, but expressed in a younger, more impulsive form. When he walked into a room, people could never predict whether he would tip his hat politely or slam a fist against the wall in sudden rage. And then there was his mother, Eleanor Dunn, a woman who lived behind carefully arranged smiles and lace-trimmed dresses. She had once been considered Fairwater's beauty, a delicate rose of southern gentility. But years under Silas's rule had wilted her spirit. Her eyes, soft and blue, seemed carved from glass, lovely but brittle. She kept a rosary tucked into the pocket of her apron, its beads worn smooth by decades of anxious fingers. Eleanor rarely raised her voice, but her whispers held desperate urgency. A neighbor recalled seeing her in town before Christmas the previous year, clutching a basket of sewing mends and muttering, "A woman must keep her home peaceful, even when peace is not offered to her." Another recalled overhearing Eleanor pleading with Silas after a supper argument. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "let it rest for tonight. The girl did nothing wrong." Silas's answer cut through the house like a blade. "She did," he said. "She breathed in my presence without permission." The girl, the one the Dunns would later accuse of wickedness, had been standing in the hallway, her back pressed against the wall as quietly as a shadow. She did not flinch. She did not speak. She had learned long ago that silence was safer than truth. Her name was Mariah. She had been born into bondage in the final years of the war and freed legally by its end. But freedom did not come with land or wages or opportunity. For children like Mariah, freedom was something written on paper in far-off capitals, not a force that changed a life already bent by hunger and hardship. When her mother died of fever, Mariah was barely 13, too small to work the fields and too quiet to attract help. The Dunns took her in, a gesture they branded as charity, though no one could recall ever seeing her paid. By 17, she moved through the Dunn home with the obedient precision expected of her. She rose before dawn to churn the milk, tended the embers of the kitchen hearth, washed mud from Silas's boots, and stitched tears in Eleanor's dresses with the neat, trembling hands. Those who saw her up close said she carried a cold stillness in her expression, not an emptiness, but something locked deep beneath the surface, as though her true self waited behind a hidden door. Her appearance had a quiet beauty the Dunn home never acknowledged. Her skin was dark, smooth, luminous, her hair coiled in tight spirals that she braided with practiced speed. Her eyes were large and dark, reflecting more than they revealed. On rare occasions when Mariah believed no one was watching, she hummed soft melodies learned from her mother, hymns about deliverance, sorrow, and unseen justice. But someone was always watching. It was Nathaniel who first fixated on her. At 18, Mariah felt his gaze like a weight at the back of her neck. He would linger by the kitchen doorway longer than necessary, pretend to search for something on a shelf simply to stand near her, lean closer when giving orders. One evening, Eleanor caught him gripping Mariah's wrist in the pantry, his voice low and threatening. "Don't walk away from me," he hissed. "A man deserves respect." Mariah's voice had been barely audible. "Yes, sir." Eleanor, pale with fear, intervened. "Nathaniel," she pleaded, "this is not how a Christian behaves." His reply was a sneer. "Don't preach at me, Mother." Silas, of course, saw nothing, or pretended not to. When Mariah turned 19, Silas announced at supper that the household required proper unity and that Nathaniel would be taking a wife. Eleanor smiled tightly, relieved at the thought of introducing some gentle young lady into Nathaniel's stormy life. But Silas cleared his throat and said, "The arrangement will stay in the family. The girl will do." Eleanor froze. Nathaniel grinned, and Mariah stared down at her plate, her hands so still they might have belonged to a statue. No one in town attended the ceremony. It was held quietly, behind closed doors. Officiated by a pastor Silas paid generously to overlook the irregularities of the union. Afterward, neighbors noticed no wedding ring on Mariah's hand, no celebrations, no signs of a fair union. Instead, she continued her duties with the same mechanical grace as before, only now bruises appeared more frequently on her wrists and upper arms. When the pastor visited a month later, he asked gently, "Child, do you find peace in this new chapter?" Mariah responded with a hollow smile. "I find what I'm given, Reverend." He paused, troubled. "If you ever need help." Silas stepped between them. "She needs nothing but discipline." And that was the end of the pastor's concern. But something had begun to shift in Mariah. Servants noticed her moving through the house with a new kind of quietude. Not the submissive silence of fear, but the concentrated stillness of someone watching, calculating, waiting. She asked questions in the kitchen about herbs, tinctures, and powders, framing them as curiosity about home remedies. Eleanor, distracted and weary, answered without suspicion. "This root eases fever," she would say. "This powder helps me sleep." Mariah listened, memorized, learned. One servant overheard her late at night in her tiny room, whispering a prayer that was not quite a plea and not quite a confession. "Lord, she murmured. "You see what happens in this house? You see what they take. You see what they do. Show me what to do. Show me what to do." A week later, the first Dunn fell ill. It began with a sound so small that no one in the Dunn house would have remembered it, if not for all that followed, the faint rattle of a spoon against a porcelain cup. Nathaniel had been the first to complain. It was a late morning in early April, the kind when the air feels heavy even before noon, and the scent of wet clay creeps in through the open windows. Mariah stood at the stove, stirring cornmeal in a cast-iron pot, when Nathaniel pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping harshly against the floorboards. "Did you put something different in this?" he muttered, staring down at his half-full cup of coffee. Mariah didn't turn. "No, sir." Nathaniel's voice carried a note of suspicion sharpened by discomfort. "Tastes bitter. Wrong." Eleanor looked up from her sewing basket. "Nathaniel, your father told you not to drink so much coffee on an empty stomach. It's likely nothing more than—" "Nobody asked you, Mother." Silas, seated at the head of the table, drummed his fingers once, slow, deliberate. "Enough. Finish your breakfast. There's work to be done." Nathaniel shot a narrow glance toward Mariah. She felt it but did not meet it. She ladled the cornmeal quietly into a wooden bowl, placed it on the table, and stepped back with practiced indifference. But when Nathaniel took a spoonful, his face tightened as though something pinched him from the inside. "Stomach," he muttered. "Feels strange." Eleanor reached for him, worry washing over her features. "You look pale, sweetheart." "Leave me be," he snapped, pushing her hand away. Within minutes, sweat beaded on his forehead. He rose unsteadily, one hand gripping the back of his chair. Mariah noticed, though she pretended not to, how his fingers trembled. Silas stood halfway, his chair scraping a single heavy note. "Nathaniel." "I'm fine," the young man growled, though his voice had lost its strength. "Just need air." He stepped outside, boots striking unevenly across the porch. Eleanor set aside her sewing, her lips trembling faintly. "Something's wrong." Silas dismissed her concern with a wave of his hand. "Boy's hungover, let him walk it off." But by evening, Nathaniel had not improved. His skin was ashen, his hands cold. He retched into the wash basin until his ribs ached, and still Silas insisted it was nothing more than fever brought on by the weather. Yet other signs soon followed, signs so small, so subtle, that only someone paying close attention would have seen the pattern. A dying barn cat found curled near the Dunn's well, foam dried at its mouth. A cluster of house sparrows lying motionless beneath the kitchen window, wings stiff, necks strangely contorted. The peculiar metallic odor that seemed to cling to the well bucket no matter how many times the servants scrubbed it. Eleanor noticed. On the third morning after Nathaniel fell ill, she walked into the kitchen and found Mariah wiping down the wash table, slowly, methodically, as though her mind were elsewhere entirely. "Child," Eleanor whispered, "have you seen the birds outside? It's unsettling. I wonder if a sickness is moving through the area." Mariah lifted her gaze. For a moment, only a moment, Eleanor thought she saw something cold, distant, calculating behind those dark eyes. But then the girl lowered her head and would have seen the pattern. A dying barn cat found curled near the Dunn's well, foam dried at its mouth. A cluster of house sparrows lying motionless beneath the kitchen window, wings stiff, necks strangely contorted. The peculiar metallic odor that seemed to cling to the well bucket no matter how many times the servants scrubbed it. Eleanor noticed. On the third morning after Nathaniel fell ill, she walked into the kitchen and found Mariah wiping down the wash table, slowly, methodically, as though her mind were elsewhere entirely. "Child," Eleanor whispered, "have you seen the birds outside? It's unsettling. I wonder if a sickness is moving through the area." Mariah lifted her gaze. For a moment, only a moment, Eleanor thought she saw something cold, distant, calculating behind those dark eyes. But then the girl lowered her head again. "Yes, ma'am," she murmured. "Maybe it's the season changing." Eleanor clasped her rosary inside her apron pocket. Perhaps. That afternoon, Nathaniel's condition worsened. His breathing grew ragged, skin clammy, and an angry redness crept across his chest. Silas finally summoned the town physician, Dr. Abram Colling, a thin, austere man who carried the scent of iodine everywhere he went. Dr. Colling listened carefully to Nathaniel's heartbeat, felt his pulse, inspected his tongue. When he finished, he closed his medical bag with a solemn snap. "What's your diagnosis?" Silas demanded. The doctor hesitated. "It may be foodborne, some form of toxin or spoiled grain." Silas's eyes flared. "Are you accusing my household of mishandling provisions?" The doctor raised his palms. "I accuse no one. I simply state possibilities." Nathaniel groaned then, low, guttural, like an animal in pain. Eleanor rushed to his side, tears streaking her cheeks. "Please," she begged, "help him. Give him something." Dr. Colling muttered, "I will prepare a tonic," though his expression suggested doubt. As he turned away, he caught Mariah lingering in the doorway, her face unreadable, her hands folded neatly at her waist. He offered her a gentle nod. "You there, can you fetch clean water from the well?" Mariah's eyes flickered. "Yes, sir." Silas grunted. "Make sure she brings enough for the house, not only for you." Mariah hurried outside, skirts brushing the dirt as she moved swiftly toward the well. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. A crow circled overhead. When she reached the well, she paused, her hand resting on the rope. If anyone had been watching, they might have noticed how long she stood there before lowering the bucket, how her shoulders lifted as she inhaled deeply, how her grip tightened on the rope with quiet resolve. When she returned with the water, Dr. Colling thanked her kindly. "You're a dutiful young woman." Mariah lowered her eyes. "Yes, sir." But her heart was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. Within a day, the birds around the Dunn property began dying in greater numbers. A mule collapsed near the fence line, pupils dilated. One of the farm hands whispered uneasily to another, "Something foul's in the air, I'm telling you." The reply came in a low hiss. "Careful. The master doesn't take kindly to talk of curses." Nathaniel's symptoms spread to Eleanor next. At breakfast, she clutched her stomach suddenly, as though stabbed by an invisible blade. The color drained from her face. Oh dear," she breathed, sinking into her chair. Silas stood quickly, the first sign of genuine alarm cracking through his stern exterior. "Eleanor?" She tried to steady herself, but her hands shook violently. Across the room, Mariah watched from the kitchen doorway, expression still unreadable, as if carved from shadow. Eleanor's breathing grew shallow. "Silas," she whispered. "Call the doctor again, please." Silas hesitated only a second before barking an order to one of the servants. "Ride, fetch Colling. Tell him my wife needs him at once." Mariah stepped silently to Eleanor's side, offering a cloth for her trembling hands. Eleanor reached for her, eyes glassy. "Mariah," she whispered, "the house feels wrong lately. So wrong." Mariah did not answer. Instead, she pressed the cloth gently into Eleanor's palm, her touch soft, almost tender. Dr. Colling returned by midday, sweat slicking his brow. He checked Eleanor's pulse, examined her tongue, and then sank heavily into a chair. "This is no mere fever," he murmured. Silas leaned forward, voice tight. "What are you implying?" The doctor hesitated again, but for too long, and in that silence, Something began to coil inside Silas Dunn's mind. A suspicion, a possibility, a threat. "Tell me," Silas said, his voice dropping to a warning growl. "What ails my family?" Dr. Collins swallowed hard. "Poison. I fear poison." Silas stood so quickly his chair toppled backward. His eyes shifted to the doorway where Mariah still stood, quiet as dusk. And in that moment, though he said nothing aloud, a look of cold, dawning horror crossed his face, not because he believed it, but because he suddenly wondered if it might be true. Outside, thunder rolled in slow, distant waves. Inside, the first seeds of dread began to take root. Fear seeped into the Dunn household the way dampness seeps into old timber, quietly at first, almost invisibly, until suddenly the structure groans under its weight. For days, the air inside the home felt tense enough to hum, as though every breath carried the risk of shattering something fragile and dangerous. By then, the deaths of sparrows and barn cats had stopped being coincidences. The farmhands muttered prayers under their breath, and each night Mariah's shadow moved through the halls like an omen the house itself was trying not to acknowledge. But it was the third night after Eleanor fell ill that the fear truly took hold. A storm had rolled in late, bringing hard rain that struck the roof boards like thrown pebbles. The lantern in Nathaniel's sick room cast a dim glow across his twisted sheets. He writhed in a feverish daze, muttering half-coherent phrases that made Eleanor tremble more deeply than her sickness already had. "She's watching me. She stands right there in the corner," he gasped. Don't let her touch me again." Silas glared at him. "Speak sense. No one has touched you." But Nathaniel's eyes darted wildly toward the corner of the room, where Mariah indeed stood silently, her hands folded before her, just as she had been ordered. When her presence caught his eye, Nathaniel recoiled violently against the headboard. "Get her out!" he screamed. "Get her out of this room!" Mariah did not move. She did not speak. She merely stared with that hollow, distant calm. Eleanor's trembling voice cut through the storm's noise. "Silas, she frightens him." "She obeys," Silas muttered, jaw tightening. "That's all that matters." But obedience was no longer enough, not when the fever, the pain, and the doctor's grave warnings all pointed to something unnatural festering within the Dunn household. When Dr. Colling returned the next morning, he brought with him an air of dread that clung to his coat as heavily as the rainwater dripping from its hem. Setting his bag down with a deliberate care, he said quietly, "I must ask again about your water source, and your grain, and anything else that may have recently changed." Silas bristled. "You think my family's illness is due to poor upkeep? Are you accusing me?" "I am trying to save your household," the doctor interrupted, his normally mild voice sharpened by urgency. "But I cannot do so unless I have the truth. Something is poisoning the Dunns. This is not a natural sickness." Nathaniel groaned then, clutching his abdomen, his body curling in on itself. Silas's temper erupted. "Then fix it!" "I cannot fix what I do not understand," Dr. Collins shot back. His gaze flickered, only briefly, toward Mariah standing in the doorway. Silas followed that look, and the house seemed to still around them. "Come here," Silas ordered. Mariah stepped forward with slow, measured grace. Rainwater dripped from her hem. She had been outside washing linens, hands submerged in icy water that numbed her skin but not her thoughts. "Sir?" she asked softly. Silas's voice wavered, not with fear, but with a strain he had not known since the war. "What have you done to this family?" The question hung between them like a falling blade. Mariah blinked once. "Nothing, sir." Silas stepped closer. "Dr. Colling believes poison is being brought into this house, and you handle the food. You fetch the water, you—" "I do what I'm told," she whispered. Eleanor reached weakly toward her husband. Silas, stop. The girl wouldn't, she couldn't. But Silas wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Mariah's face, searching for any flicker of guilt. He found none. Just a calm emptiness that terrified him in a way he did not understand. Leave the room, Silas commanded. All of you. I need to speak with her alone. Eleanor gasped. No, Silas, don't. But the servants backed away. Even Dr. Colling hesitated before stepping into the hallway. Only Nathaniel remained, twitching in fever, muttering broken accusations beneath his breath. When the door shut, Silas approached Mariah slowly. You look at me when I speak, he said. This time, she lifted her gaze, dark, deep, unbroken. That's better, he murmured. Now tell me the truth. Has someone paid you to do this? Have you been influenced by outside agitators? He spat the white word as though it tasted foul. Or have you taken up with those radicals in town? No, sir. Then why are my son and wife dying? Mariah's voice was softer than the rain hitting the windows. Because something in this house has been wrong for a very long time. Silas's hands shot out, gripping her chin with bruising force. Speak plainly. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, but a kind of weary resolve. Maybe God is finally watching, she said. Silas recoiled as if struck. A moment of pure, stunned silence stretched. Then he slapped her. The sound echoed through the walls. Servants waiting outside startled at the crack of it. Inside, Mariah did not cry out. She merely turned her face back toward him, slowly, deliberately, like someone returning from a long distance. Get out, Silas hissed. Get out of my sight, and stay where I can find you. She walked past him without a word. But as she reached the doorway, she paused. Not long, not dramatically. Just long enough for Silas to feel the weight of her silence. She bowed her head slightly. Yes, sir? And then she disappeared into the dim hallway. That night the rain finally stopped, but the house grew colder. Farm hands whispered about hearing strange sounds, footsteps in the cellar when no one was below, the creak of the back door opening though the servants had all retired, the faintest murmur of a woman's voice drifting through the walls. The same phrase repeated. Show me what to do. Show me what to do. By the 5th day of illness, Eleanor could no longer stand. Her rosary beads slipped through trembling fingers that had lost all strength. She called for Mariah repeatedly, almost desperately, though Silas forbade it. Let her stay away from you, he barked. She's done enough. But Eleanor shook her head weakly. She's the only one who is gentle. Silas stopped responding. By the 6th day, neighbors began to talk. Lights burning at all hours. Screams echoing from the Dunn estate. Dr. Colling making repeated frantic visits. The youngest Dunn boy, 11-year-old Thomas, seen crying outside the smokehouse, refusing to re-enter the house. Fear spread faster than the sickness itself. One woman whispered to her husband at the mercantile, I heard they found dead birds on every side of the property. Another murmured, That house carries a curse now. A third said under her breath, Silas Dunn's past has come calling. And still Mariah worked, quietly, methodically, moving through the house like she had always belonged to its shadows. But late one night, as she prepared a pot of broth for Eleanor, who had begun slipping in and out of consciousness, she overheard 2 servants whispering in the pantry. You think the master's right? Think the girl's behind it? One asked. If she is, the other whispered shakily, then God help us all. Mariah stood motionless, hand resting on the wooden spoon. They did not know she was listening. They did not see the faint rise and fall of her breath, or the tear that threatened, then hardened into nothing. By the 7th day, Nathaniel's screams woke the entire house. His nails tore at his own skin. Dr. Colling shook his head in defeated horror. "I have seen arsenic poisoning before," the doctor whispered privately to Silas. "But never in such slow, deliberate doses." Silas stared at him. "Deliberate?" "Yes," the doctor said. "This was no accident." In that moment, something in Silas snapped. His voice rose like a man possessed. "Bring her to me. Bring the girl now." But Mariah did not come. She was already heading into the dark, descending the stairs toward the root cellar, where the secrets waited, where the sheriff would later find the jars, where the truth began its long, cold bloom. The lantern in Silas Dunn's hand shook with each step he took down the narrow cellar staircase, its dim flame throwing broken shards of light across the wooden walls. Every breath he drew sounded harsh in the cramped space, echoing off the stones as though the cellar itself exhaled with him. Behind him, Dr. Colling followed reluctantly, clutching his medical bag like a talisman. Two servants trailed them, men who had worked the farm for years but suddenly looked like frightened children. "Keep your eyes open," Silas barked, though his voice cracked halfway through. "She came down here. I saw her with my own eyes." Dr. Colling swallowed. "Mr. Dunn, perhaps she's simply—" "Do not make excuses for her," Silas snapped. The doctor fell silent. The cellar door creaked behind them as the storm winds pushed against it. A faint draft stirred the dust in the air, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent. Silas paused and sniffed, confused. "What is that smell?" he muttered. Dr. Colling inhaled lightly. "Chemicals, perhaps, but it's too faint to identify." The servants exchanged uneasy looks. Silas moved forward again. The cellar had always been a place of storage. Potatoes, winter vegetables, jars of preserves, a few forgotten tools. But as they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found the shelves disturbed. Jars were misaligned. A burlap sack lay torn open on the floor. A solitary onion rolled slowly across the dirt as though nudged by some unseen hand. "She was here," Silas growled. "She's hiding something." But Mariah was nowhere in sight. Instead, Silas's lantern flickered across the far wall and stopped on a small wooden table pushed oddly askew, as if someone had moved it recently. On top of it lay a small ceramic bowl and a folded scrap of cloth, stained with something dark. Silas rushed forward, knocking over a crate. "What is this?" he snarled. Dr. Colling set his bag down and approached cautiously. "Let me look." The doctor picked up the cloth and unfolded it. Inside lay a fine powder, pale, almost white, but with a faint bluish tint. He froze. "Mr. Dunn," he whispered. "I believe this is arsenic." Silas's breath stopped in his chest. "How much?" he asked. "Enough," the doctor said solemnly. "To kill a household." A cold, strange quiet filled the cellar. Silas's eyes darkened. "Where is she?" As if in response, a floorboard creaked overhead. Then another. The servants leapt. "She's in the house!" one cried. Silas stormed toward the stairs. But as they reached the cellar door, they found it already open, and the hallway beyond dim, strange, unnaturally still. Mariah stood at the far end of the corridor, half in darkness, half in light. Her posture was rigid but unafraid, hands clasped behind her back. The faint glow from a distant lantern painted her face in gold and shadow. Behind her, the staircase to the upper floors loomed like the mouth of a waiting beast. Silas's fury erupted. "Oh, you wicked little—" But Dr. Colling grabbed his arm. "Wait," the doctor whispered. Mariah's eyes met Silas's. Calm, steady, ancient in a way no 19-year-old's eyes should ever be. "Why?" Silas demanded, his voice breaking under the weight of everything he refused to understand. "Why would you do this?" After we fed you, housed you, gave you a place. A place, Mariah repeated softly. Is that what you call it? Her voice echoed strangely in the narrow hall. For a moment, even the storm outside seemed to pause. Silas stepped toward her. You will answer for this. You will answer for every... But he never finished that sentence. Because a scream ripped through the house from upstairs, high, shrill, unmistakably young. Thomas, the youngest Dunn boy. Silas pushed past Mariah and thundered up the stairs, nearly knocking her aside. Dr. Colling and the servants followed. Mariah remained still for a few seconds, watching their frantic ascent. Then, slowly, she began to walk after them, each step measured, deliberate, as though she already knew what they would find. Upstairs, chaos had erupted. Thomas lay curled on the floor of the hallway, his small hands gripping his stomach, his face contorted with pain. His cries tore through the house, high-pitched and terrified. "Papa," he sobbed, "it hurts! It hurts!" Eleanor, pale and fevered, dragged herself from her bedroom doorway, her fingers scratching desperately at the floorboards as she tried to reach her son. "Tommy! Oh, God! Tommy!" Silas fell to his knees beside the boy. "Who did this to you?" he demanded, shaking him gently. "Tell me what you drank." Thomas whimpered. "Just milk. Like always. Mama gave it to me." Eleanor collapsed, her strength failing entirely. Silas turned wild-eyed to his wife. "Did you taste it? Did you drink from the same jug?" She nodded weakly. Dr. Colling ran to Thomas's side, examining the boy's eyes, breath, and pulse. "Same symptoms," the doctor said grimly. "Mr. Dunn, your entire household has been exposed." Silas staggered back. "That girl," he whispered. "She poisoned all of us." Mariah stood at the foot of the stairs, listening silently. "Say it," Silas roared at her. "Say what you've done." Mariah tilted her head slightly. "You never saw," she murmured. "You never listened." Silas surged to his feet, lunging toward her, but the doctor caught him again. "Let me speak to her," Dr. Colling insisted. "Let me try." Silas shoved the doctor away. "Try nothing. She'll answer to me." But Dr. Colling stepped between them, sweat trickling down his temple. "Mariah," he said, gentler than anyone had spoken to her in years. "If you did this, if you harmed these people, we need to understand why." Mariah's gaze drifted over the Dunn family, over Eleanor struggling to breathe, over Thomas writhing in agony, over Nathaniel's fever-racked body down the hall. Then she looked at Silas. "You think this began last week," she said softly. "But it began years ago. You just never noticed." Her voice was steady. Too steady. Dr. Colling's breath caught. Silas snarled, "Enough riddles. Enough lies." He stepped toward her again. But this time Mariah spoke with a strange, eerie clarity. "You kept me," she said. "Called it charity. But you kept me. You made me serve, obey, stay quiet." Silas's jaw clenched. "You, ingrate. You married me to your son," she continued, her voice still soft, still calm. "You called it an arrangement. He called it a right." Nathaniel groaned from his sickbed. "Lies. She lies." But Mariah's gaze did not waver. "You bought me," she whispered. "And then you forgot that I watched everything." Silas's face twisted with rage. "You'll hang for this." Mariah nodded once. "Perhaps," she said, "but not tonight." Silas lunged. Mariah stepped back, not in fear, but with purposeful, graceful control. At that moment, a thunderous knock shook the front door of the house. Everyone froze. Another knock. Louder. Then a voice. "Sheriff's office, open up!" The servants exchanged panicked glances. Dr. Colling exhaled shakily. Thank God. But Silas' expression changed. Not relief. Realization. Someone had already gone to the sheriff. Someone from his own estate. Silas snarled. They think they have the right to barge into my home. Mariah's voice cut through his rage. You called this place yours, she murmured. But tonight, it will belong to someone else. Silas whirled toward her, but she was already descending the stairs, moving toward the sheriff's pounding. Doctor! Calling followed her, desperate to prevent disaster. Silas grabbed the pistol he kept in a drawer near the hall table. The sheriff's third pound shook the frame. Mr. Dunn, we have reason to investigate a complaint regarding poisoning in this household. The door burst open. Sheriff Amos Kellard stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, with a tobacco-rough voice and eyes that missed nothing. 2 deputies flanked him. He paused when he saw Mariah standing calmly in the foyer. She bowed her head. Evening, Sheriff, she whispered. Silas roared from the landing above. Arrest her! She's killed my family! The sheriff did not move his hand toward his gun. Instead, he studied Mariah with an unreadable expression. Young lady, do you have anything to say before I decide what happens next? Mariah's hands were steady, her breathing slow. Her voice was faint but unshaken. I have something to show you, she said. The sheriff exchanged glances with his deputies, then nodded. Lead the way. Mariah turned and walked toward the cellar. Silas screamed after her, Don't you let her finish whatever lies she has. But his voice was swallowed by the sound of the sheriff's boots descending the steps, and by the storm, and by the truth that was finally clawing its way to the surface of Fairwater's darkest household. What do you think? Guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. The sheriff moved down the cellar steps slowly, each tread groaning beneath his boots as though protesting the weight of what was coming. His lantern cast a pool of yellow light that quivered along the walls, illuminating dust motes drifting like tiny spirits in the air. Mariah descended ahead of him, quiet, deliberate, her hands clasped as though in prayer. Behind them, Dr. Calling followed with trembling reluctance, and the 2 deputies brought up the rear. Above, Silas shouted orders, curses, half-coherent threats, but none of them reached the cellar with any true force. The door was closing on his reign. Whether he understood that yet or not was irrelevant. At the bottom of the stairs, the sheriff paused. Don't touch anything, he warned the deputies. Mariah stood near the small wooden table. The ceramic bowl and the folded cloth remained exactly where Silas had found them. But now, in the lantern's heavier light, the faint blue tint of the powder inside the cloth looked almost luminescent. Sheriff Kellard stepped closer, his brows narrowing. That looks like... Lord help us, that's arsenic, ain't it? Dr. Culling swallowed. In my professional opinion, yes. I believe it is. The sheriff turned to Mariah. Where'd you get it? Her voice emerged soft, fragile, yet steady. It was here. Here? Deputy Halford barked. In the Dunn cellar. Mariah lowered her gaze. Been here for years. The sheriff frowned. Years? For what purpose? Pest control, Dr. Culling murmured. Some families kept arsenic for rats, but not in this quantity. Sheriff Kellard stared at Mariah. Did you know what it was? Yes, she answered simply. You use it? Yes. The sheriff's breath caught in his throat. Girl, you realize what you're admitting? Mariah raised her eyes. The look in them wasn't pride or fear or regret. It was something deeper, something ancient, heavy, hollow. I realize, she whispered. The sheriff rubbed his beard. Then I need you to tell me something plainly. No riddles, no half-truths. Did you use this poison on the Dunns? Mariah looked past him, toward the dark corners of the cellar. A house remembers, she murmured. A house keeps its wounds. The sheriff stepped closer. Child, he said softly, I can't help you unless you tell me the truth. But Mariah wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze had drifted to the farthest shelf, the one partially hidden by a stack of wooden crates. She walked toward it slowly, brushed aside a hanging cobweb, and retrieved a small, wax-sealed jar Silas had never mentioned. When she turned back, her hands trembled for the first time. This, she said, offering the jar to the sheriff, was my mother's. Dr. Colling blinked. Your mother's? Yes, Mariah whispered. Silas kept it, as payment for the debt he said she owed him. The sheriff stiffened. What debt? Mariah inhaled shakily. She was sick, fever. He said he'd give her medicine if she worked extra hours, but the medicine was spoiled. She died. He kept this. The sheriff stared at the jar. What is it? Mariah's voice fell to barely more than breath. Her hair, cut after she passed. He kept it like a trophy. The cellar fell into stunned silence. Even the deputies seemed to shrink under the weight of the revelation. From upstairs, Silas's shouts continued, angry, confused, unaware that every word Mariah said was another nail in his coffin. The sheriff swallowed hard. Did he force you to marry Nathaniel? Yes. How old were you? 19 when the pastor spoke the vows. She hesitated. But younger when Nathaniel began, when he started. Her voice trailed off. The sheriff lowered his head. Did Silas force himself on you? He asked gently. Mariah didn't answer. She didn't need to. Something in her stillness told the truth. Dr. Colling stepped forward, voice trembling. Mariah, why didn't you speak? Why didn't you tell the pastor, or me, or anyone? Tell who? She whispered. And say what? That the Dunn family hurt me? That the men who run this town would punish them? Would believe me? Her eyes glistened. Men like Silas controlled everything. He owned this town more than the mayor. He owned the sheriff before you. He owned the pastor. He owned my life. The sheriff shut his eyes. Deputy Halford exhaled shakily. Lord help us. Mariah's voice deepened. I asked God to save me. For years, every night I asked him, but he only listened when I stopped asking. The sheriff took a step back, shaken in a way he did not understand. Are you telling us, he said slowly, that you poisoned the Dunns because of what they did to you? Mariah looked directly at him. No, she said. I poisoned them because they were never going to stop. Her words struck the cellar like a blow. Silas's voice roared above them. Sheriff, get up here. This nonsense ends now. The sheriff met Mariah's gaze, and for a moment, just a moment, something like pity flickered across his hardened features. Deputy, he murmured, go fetch Silas Dunn. Deputy Halford nodded and hurried up the steps. But before he could reach the top, a sudden silence fell upstairs. A heavy silence. The kind that makes men grip their weapons without knowing why. Then a single gunshot. The sheriff and deputies drew their pistols instantly. Move, Sheriff Kellard ordered. They rushed up the stairs, lanterns swaying wildly, shadows stretching like twisted limbs across the walls. At the top of the stairs, the sheriff found Deputy Halford frozen, staring wide-eyed down the hallway. What happened? The sheriff barked. Halford swallowed hard. Silas shot at her. Shot at who? Halford shook his head as though he couldn't believe what he'd witnessed. I think he was aiming for the girl, but she wasn't there. The sheriff pushed past him. Silas Dunn stood at the far end of the hallway, pistol smoking in his hand, eyes wild. His face was drenched in sweat, his hair plastered to his temples. Behind him, the doorway to Eleanor's room glowed faintly with lantern light. "You will not take her word over mine," Silas bellowed. "She is a liar, a wicked little serpent. She's poisoning my family. She is—" But the sheriff had already raised his gun. "Put the weapon down, Silas." Silas ignored him. "Where is she? Where's that snake?" "She's downstairs," the sheriff said. "She was here," Silas roared, pointing toward the empty space near the banister. "Standing right there. I saw her with my own—" He stopped abruptly, because something moved behind him. Slowly, almost silently. Silas turned. Eleanor Dunn was standing in the doorway of her bedroom, pale, trembling, barely clinging to consciousness. Her nightgown clung loosely to her frail body. Her eyes had a strange clarity, a clarity she had not shown in days. "Silas," she whispered. Her voice was thin, weak enough that a breath of wind could have carried it away, but Silas heard it with perfect clarity. He turned toward her. "Eleanor, sweetheart, go back to bed." She stared at him. "You shot," she said softly. "In our home." Silas's hand tightened on his gun. "I shot at her, at that demon." Eleanor's gaze slid toward the sheriff, then to the deputies, then back to her husband. "No demon stands in this house," she murmured. "Only the men who made it sick." Silas froze. "What did you say?" Eleanor took one unsteady step forward, then another. Each step seemed to drain what little strength remained in her body. "You brought poison," she whispered. You brought it here long before Mariah ever touched a jar." Silas's face contorted. "I don't know what lies she's filled your head with." "This house rotted under your hand," Eleanor continued. "Not hers." Silas lifted his pistol. Eleanor didn't flinch. "Silas," she said, "Mariah didn't destroy this family, you did." The sheriff tensed. Silas's lips peeled back in something between a snarl and a scream. "You ungrateful." But he never finished the sentence. Because Thomas began screaming from down the hall again, shrill, agonized screams that shattered every word Silas tried to form. The sheriff seized the moment. He lunged. Silas fired, but the bullet struck the wall, splintering the wood inches from the sheriff's shoulder. In 3 strides, Sheriff Kellard was on him, tackling him to the ground. The pistol skittered across the floor. Deputies surged forward, restraining the furious patriarch as he thrashed like a wounded animal. "Let me go!" Silas bellowed. "She's the devil! She did this!" The sheriff pinned him with a knee to the spine. "Silas Dunn, you're under arrest." "For what?" Silas screamed. "For being poisoned? For being the victim here?" "No," the sheriff growled, breath heavy. "For attempted murder." Silas froze. His eyes darted to the wall, where the bullet had lodged, only a foot from where a woman had been standing moments before. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Mariah had climbed the stairs silently. She now stood near the bottom of the landing, watching it all unfold. The sheriff looked at her. "Mariah," he said slowly, "you're coming with us too." She nodded once. The Dunn household sagged under the weight of its unraveling. Nathaniel's fevered moans drifted down the hallway. Thomas sobbed weakly on the floor. Eleanor leaned against the doorframe, her body trembling but her gaze steady. As the sheriff gathered his deputies, Silas raged, spitting accusations that no longer held power. Eleanor lowered her head, whispering prayers for children she could no longer help. Mariah turned her gaze to the cellar door, where the truth still waited, pale blue and deadly. And the sheriff wondered for the first time in his long career whether he was escorting a sinner or a survivor. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. The jailhouse lanterns burned low by the time the sheriff escorted both Silas Dunn and Mariah into town, their horses kicking up clods of damp earth along the muddy road. Rainwater clung to the fields on either side, glinting under the moonlight like scattered shards of broken mirrors. Night had fallen heavy and exhausted, a night that wanted to sleep, if not for the grim procession winding its way toward Fairwater's small wooden jail. Mariah rode in silence. Her hands were bound, though loosely, as though the sheriff himself felt uncertain about the gesture. Silas, however, was tied so tightly, his wrists bled against the coarse rope, his rage stretching him forward in jerking motions. "You're fools!" Silas spat at the sheriff and his deputies. "Every last one of you. She poisoned my kin. She slaughtered my family under my own roof. And you ride with her like she's some misplaced lamb." Sheriff Keller did not respond. "You think she's innocent?" Silas roared. "You think she hasn't bewitched this entire county?" Still, the sheriff remained silent, though his jaw tightened. Mariah did not look at Silas. She stared straight ahead at the road, the wind pulling stray strands of her hair loose from the fabric that had been tied around it. Her expression was not cold or triumphant. If anything, it bore the strange calm of someone who had outlived fear itself. When they reached Fairwater proper, lanterns flickered in windows. Dogs barked. A few townsfolk peeked from behind curtains as the sheriff led the prisoners towards the courthouse. Word of the Dunn tragedy had spread faster than the fever that had killed half the family, and whispers ran through the streets like skittering shadows. "They say the girl bewitched them." "No, she poisoned them with rat chemicals. Saw the doctor riding hard toward the estate." "Silas Dunn shot at her, I heard. Shot at his wife, too. That whole house was cursed." A group of men stood outside the tavern, their shoulders hunched against the cold. One of them stepped forward, his breath fogging the air. "That her," he muttered. "That's the Dunn girl." The sheriff's voice cut sharply. "Stand aside." The men parted, but slowly, reluctantly, like predators allowing a rival to pass only temporarily. Mariah did not look at them. Her gaze remained fixed ahead. Inside the courthouse, Sheriff Keller ordered Silas dragged to a cell. The deputies hauled him in, kicking and cursing until they slammed the iron door behind him. "You can't lock me in here," Silas bellowed. "I am a Dunn. This town runs by the Dunn name. You hear me? I'll have your badge for this, Amos." The sheriff ignored him and motioned for Mariah to be seated on a wooden bench while he lit a lamp and wiped the rain from his coat sleeves. "Mariah," he said, lowering himself into a chair opposite to her. "Before I notify the magistrate, I need the truth. The full truth. Did you intend to kill the Dunns?" Mariah looked down at her bound hands. "I intended to stop them. By killing them. By ending what they did." The sheriff clasped his hands together. "I need you to understand. Ending a life is murder under Mississippi law, no matter the reason." Mariah's eyes lifted. They were dark, not empty, but impossibly tired. "Does the law protect girls like me?" she asked quietly. The sheriff opened his mouth, closed it. Mariah continued, "When Nathaniel touched me, when he hit me, did the law help me? When Silas locked me in the pantry for speaking out of turn, when he took my mother's hair like a prize, when he made me stand in my wedding dress while the pastor closed his eyes so he wouldn't see what was wrong?" Her voice deepened, not loud, not angry, but carved from something ancient. "Did the law protect me then, Sheriff?" The sheriff exhaled, long and slow. "We can't fix what happened. You're right," Mariah whispered. "We can't." Silas's voice boomed from his cell. "She lies. Every word is poison. She's playing you all." The sheriff slammed his fist on the table. "Silas, enough!" Then he turned back to Mariah. "Tell me," he said, "what happened in that cellar? All of it." Mariah drew in a breath and began. "When I was 13, she whispered. "My mother got sick. The fever burned through her so fast she couldn't stand by the second day. She asked Silas for help. He laughed, said he'd help her after she cleaned the smokehouse. She worked while coughing blood onto her apron. Her hands trembled slightly. He gave her tonic for her fever. I watched her drink it. She said it tasted wrong, bitter, but she was too weak to argue. She died that night. Silas said it was God's will." The sheriff felt a chill crawl up his arms. "I slept in the kitchen after that," Mariah continued. "Eleanor tried to be kind when Silas wasn't watching. She gave me a blanket in winter, told me to say my prayers, but she never stopped him. She couldn't." She paused. "Then Nathaniel grew older. He liked to follow me, corner me, hold my wrist and say I owed him obedience. When I turned 19, Silas said a girl like me was wasteful unless put to use. He told the pastor I was family. He told the town I was grateful. He told me I would be Nathaniel's wife." Her voice cracked, for the first time. The sheriff swallowed hard. "Mariah, I'm sorry." She did not look up. "I lived behind their walls for 6 years. I prayed for 6 years. I waited for 6 years. But God wasn't coming. Nobody was coming. So I learned to listen. Then I learned to watch. Then I learned what lived in the Dunn cellar." She gestured toward the jars. "Silas kept arsenic the way other men keep silver. He used it on animals that wandered into his fields. Sometimes on men too, men who spoke against him." The sheriff's eyes widened. "What?" "It wasn't just rats that died in the Dunn house," she whispered. "It was any creature Silas decided didn't belong." Silas's furious voice slammed against his cell door. "Lies! All lies!" Mariah didn't flinch. "I didn't plan to kill them, not at first. I only wanted to make them weak, make them scared, make them see what fear felt like. So I put a little in Nathaniel's coffee. Not enough to kill, just enough to hurt." She looked at her hands again. "But then Eleanor drank the same water, Thomas too, and I realized something." She paused. "When you try to poison the roots of a tree, the sickness spreads to every branch." The sheriff leaned back, overwhelmed. "Mariah, why didn't you stop?" She finally looked him in the eye. "Because none of them tried to stop when it was me." Silas roared from his cell. "I'll kill you, you vile—" "Silas," the sheriff shouted back. "One more word and I'll gag you." The jail fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the sheriff stood and motioned to the deputies. "Cut her ties. Let her breathe." The deputies hesitated. "Sheriff, she admitted it." "She admitted to surviving," Kellard growled. "Cut them." The rope fell away. Mariah rubbed her wrists gently, almost tenderly. Then a sound outside caught their attention. The swift clatter of hooves. Rain boots on wood. The courthouse door flung open, and Reverend Abner Hayes hurried in, soaked to the bone, glasses fogged, breath sharp and uneven. "Sheriff Kellard," the Reverend gasped. "I came as soon as I heard. Dear God, is it true? Is the Dunn family poisoned?" "Yes," the sheriff replied. "By this girl?" Mariah met the Reverend's gaze. He looked away. The sheriff pointed toward Silas's cell. "Before you rush to judgment, Reverend, you should know the Dunn household wasn't exactly the sanctuary of Christian virtue it pretended to be." The Reverend wiped his glasses with trembling hands. "Sheriff, there are whispers about the Dunns, yes, but poison is—" "It wasn't just poison," Kellard said. "It was suffering, years of it." The Reverend looked between Mariah and Silas, his expression shifting from confusion to discomfort to something resembling recognition. "I told Silas months ago," Reverend Hayes murmured. That what he did to that girl was unholy. Silas screamed from his cell. You sanctimonious coward! You took my coin! The Reverend flinched. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. That true, Reverend? Hayes stammered. I officiated the marriage under pressure. I regretted it the moment I rode away. Pressure? Silas howled. I paid you, you trembling worm. The Reverend's face paled. Mariah watched the exchange without blinking. The sheriff exhaled heavily. Reverend, I need you to testify. All of it. Hayes nodded slowly. I will. Above them, thunder rumbled, not from the sky, but from the town itself, where crowds had begun gathering outside the courthouse. Whispers churned the night air. Fear thickened like fog. Rumor and truth collided in the street. The Dunn family was powerful. Mariah was powerless. Now the story threatened to flip. One deputy peered through the window. Sheriff, there's a crowd forming. Kellard nodded. Expected as much. What do we do? We hold, the sheriff answered. We let the truth speak. Suddenly, a crash echoed from Silas's cell. Deputy, the sheriff barked. They ran. Silas had rammed his entire body weight against the iron bars. His head bled from a self-inflicted gash. His eyes were wild beyond reason. She is evil, he screamed. She is not human. You think she's a girl? She's a curse sent to destroy my house. The sheriff stared at him. Your house destroyed itself, Silas. It was her, Silas shrieked. Everything was her. My son's rage, my wife's weakness, the sickness, the fear, all her. He pounded the bars. Mariah is the devil. The sheriff turned to Mariah. She was still seated on the bench, still calm, still silent. Mariah, he said, is there anything else you need to tell me before I send word to Jackson for a magistrate? Mariah lifted her chin slightly. Yes, she said. Everyone went still. Silas pressed his face against the bars, spittle flying as he hissed. Go on then, witch. Confess. Mariah closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet. I didn't mean to kill Eleanor, she whispered. Not her. The sheriff froze. The deputy stopped breathing. Even Reverend Hayes stepped back. Mariah's tears fell silently. I only meant to weaken them, all of them, so they'd understand. Her voice broke. But Eleanor drank from the same well, and she brought Thomas the same milk. She didn't deserve that. She tried to be kind. The sheriff's voice softened. Did you love her? Mariah nodded once. Silas's voice cracked through the room like lightning. Lies. Mariah continued. I never wanted her harm. The sheriff knelt in front of her. Mariah, he said quietly, why didn't you stop when you saw she was sick? Mariah trembled at last, just once. Because when she fell ill, she whispered. Silas finally softened. He sat by her bed. He prayed. He held her hand. She paused. It was the first time I saw him afraid. The sheriff's breath stilled. Mariah's tears grew heavier. And I waited, she whispered, to see if fear would make him change, if he would free me, or even see me. Her voice cracked. But he didn't, not once. The sheriff closed his eyes. Silas screamed until his voice broke. The Reverend covered his face. Outside, the crowd grew louder. Inside, the truth pressed its weight into every corner of the courthouse. The sheriff rose slowly. Mariah, he said at last, you'll stand trial, but whatever happens next, you will not face it alone. His jaw tightened. The Dunn legacy won't smother this town anymore. Silas howled. Mariah lowered her head. In that moment, Fragile, trembling, exhausted. The full horror of what had happened in the Dunn household settled into the bones of Fairwater. Forever. The sheriff stepped toward the door. "We begin proceedings at dawn," he said. And dawn would not come gently. Dawn crept into Fairwater like a reluctant witness, pushing thin streaks of pale gray light across the courthouse windows. The sky had not yet decided whether morning would come gently or with a storm, and the horizon hung in that uneasy place between darkness and cold illumination. Inside the courthouse, the heavy scent of damp wood and old tobacco clung to the air. Sheriff Kellard had spent the entire night pacing the small office adjacent to the holding cells, the weight of the town's fear pressing into his spine with every step. By sunrise, the crowd outside had doubled. Men and women stood in tight clusters, whispering behind gloved hands. Some carried lanterns that flickered aggressively in the morning wind. Others held Bibles or rifles, as though unsure which tool their conscience would ultimately require. Inside the jail, Silas Dunn had grown quiet in the darkest way. He no longer screamed or kicked the bars. Instead, he sat hunched on the bunk, hands clasped together as though he were praying or plotting. His eyes held the crazed clarity of a cornered wolf, reflecting lamp flame in sharp gold flashes whenever a deputy passed. Mariah sat alone in the small holding room across from him. Her hands were unbound now, resting gently in her lap. She had barely spoken since midnight. Her face was composed, but exhaustion etched faint shadows beneath her eyes. Even so, there was an unyielding presence in her stillness, an internal something, neither pride nor remorse, but a strange, rooted certainty. When the sheriff approached her cell with a metal cup of water, she lifted her gaze. "Mariah," he said quietly, "the magistrate from Jackson will arrive by mid-morning. He'll hold a preliminary hearing. The judge will come within days." Mariah nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Reverend Hayes has agreed to testify about the forced marriage. Dr. Colling will speak to the poisoning. The townsfolk," his voice tightened. "Some say you're a demon, others say you're a martyr, but it doesn't matter what they say. Truth matters today." Mariah studied him for a moment. "Truth," she whispered, "is a strange thing in this town." The sheriff leaned against the iron bars. "What you did was a sin." Mariah's eyes softened, not defensive, not defiant, but unbearably tired. "What was done to me was a life." Sheriff Kellard looked away. Before he could speak again, a knock sounded sharply at the courthouse door. Deputy Miller burst inside. "Sheriff, you need to come see this." The sheriff straightened. "Miller, unless the magistrate arrived early—" "It's not the judge," the deputy interrupted. "It's that reporter from Jackson, McInnes, the one who writes for the Daily Clarion." The sheriff swore under his breath. Of course he came, like a dog scenting blood. Mariah stood silently as the sheriff brushed past, but when he reached the door to leave the room, she spoke. "Sheriff," she said gently, "don't let Silas speak first." The sheriff paused. "Why?" Mariah lowered her gaze. "Because he tells stories people want to hear. I tell the story no one wants to know." He swallowed, nodded once, and left. Outside, the air buzzed with agitation. The reporter, tall, slick-haired, carrying a leather satchel, waved a notebook as he greeted the sheriff with a too-wide grin. "Sheriff Kellard, gruesome business, isn't it? Poisoned family, enslaved bride, unholy secrets. Lord, this one's damn near biblical. Tell me, is the girl as dangerous as they say?" The sheriff's jaw clenched. "She's human." "Human?" McInnes arched an eyebrow. "They say she slit throats as easy as feeding chickens." The sheriff's glare hardened. "Then they are liars." Behind them, the crowd buzzed louder. Sheriff Kellard realized with a sinking feeling that Fairwater had ceased being a town this morning. It had become an audience, and the courthouse, a stage. He marched the reporter inside before McInnes could stir the crowd further. As they entered the corridor, Silas Dunn stood pressed against the bars of his cell. His hair was unkempt, his lips cracked, his eyes burning with violent purpose. "Sheriff," he barked. "Sheriff, bring me that pen pusher. I'll tell him the truth. I'll tell him how that demon woman poisoned—" The sheriff stepped in front of the reporter. "Silas, I swear by God, if one more lie leaves your mouth, I'll gag you until the judge arrives." Silas snarled, but fell silent. The sheriff turned to the deputy. "Keep him away from the press. No exceptions." McInnes scribbled furiously. "My word, your prisoner has some fire." "He has madness," the sheriff muttered. "And guilt." McInnes smiled thinly. "Same thing, isn't it?" The sheriff didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for McInnes to follow him toward the room where Mariah waited. But before they reached her, another figure intercepted them. A thin, sharp-faced man in black traveling clothes. His voice was smooth as lacquered wood. "Sheriff," he greeted, bowing his head slightly. "Magistrate Percival Hartwell. I trust you're prepared?" The sheriff stiffened. "You arrived early." The situation sounded urgent. Hartwell brushed dust from his coat sleeve. "A poisoning that killed half a family. Yes, I'd call that urgent." McInnes hovered behind them like a vulture. The sheriff inhaled slowly. "Before you meet the accused, I need to give context." "No need," Hartwell interrupted. "We'll begin immediately. The girl will be questioned. The patriarch, too. The truth will sort itself." The sheriff hesitated. "Magistrate, this isn't as simple as—" "Few things are simple," Hartwell replied. "But justice must be." Mariah heard their voices before she saw them. When the magistrate stepped into the holding area, his expression brushed close to curiosity but never touched compassion. "Mariah Dunn," he greeted, though he knew that wasn't truly her name. "I will ask you direct questions. You will answer them plainly." She nodded. "Did you administer poison into the Dunn household's food or water supply?" "Yes." The reporter scribbled furiously. The magistrate's eyebrows rose. "And you admit this without hesitation?" "Yes." "In what quantity?" Mariah hesitated. "Small doses. I only wanted to weaken them, make them understand." "Understand what?" Mariah swallowed. "What suffering feels like." The magistrate stepped closer. "Girl, suffering is not an excuse for murder." Mariah's voice trembled. "It wasn't supposed to be murder." "Then what was it?" "A warning." Silas roared from his cell. "A warning that killed my wife, my son, you sick—" "Silas," the sheriff barked. But the magistrate raised a hand. "Let him speak." The sheriff stiffened. "Sir." "Sheriff, I need to hear both sides." Silas surged forward, hands gripping the bars. "She lies. She's been wicked since the day her mother died in my house. She slunk around like a serpent, ungrateful, cunning, evil." Mariah looked at the floor. Silas spat. "She was born poison. I should have turned her out years ago." McInnes scribbled faster. The sheriff's patience snapped. "Silas Dunn, sit down." The magistrate finally stepped between them. "Enough. I will question the girl alone." He returned to Mariah and lowered his voice. "Mariah, why didn't you run? Why didn't you seek help? Why not flee the house instead of poisoning it?" Mariah's breath hitched. And suddenly, her words came out like something broken free. "Because you can't flee from people who own everything around you," she whispered. "Where would I run? Who would take me in? Who would believe me? Everyone in Fairwater knew what Silas Dunn could do. Everyone saw the bruises I hid. Everyone knew why I married Nathaniel. No one spoke. Silas hissed. She wanted the marriage, wanted the house. Mariah looked up sharply, and for the first time her voice rose. I wanted freedom, not your name. The magistrate held up a hand. Enough. I've heard the claims of abuse, but you still poisoned them. That is fact. Mariah nodded slowly. Yes. Then what happened next? The magistrate asked. Why did the poisoning continue even after Eleanor and Thomas fell ill? Mariah's voice softened. Because I waited. For what? The magistrate pressed. For mercy. The courthouse fell silent. For some sign that Silas felt regret, she whispered. For him to see Eleanor dying and realize what he'd done to us all. For Nathaniel to see his own sickness and understand suffering. Her hands shook. I waited because I hoped fear would make them human. She wiped a tear from her cheek. They didn't change, she whispered. Not once. The magistrate exhaled deeply. Girl, this is a tragedy, but it is still murder. Mariah lowered her head. Before the magistrate could continue, Deputy Miller raced through the door. Sheriff, magistrate, you need to see something, now. They rushed outside. The crowd had swelled into the hundreds. Men carrying rifles, women clutching rosaries, children perched on fences wide-eyed. At the center of the crowd stood a tall wooden frame, fresh lumber, tied beams, roughly assembled. A gallows. The sheriff's blood ran cold. Who built that? He demanded. A man stepped forward, broad-shouldered, red-faced, voice booming. Fairwater won't wait for a slow trial, he declared. We know who killed the Dunns. That girl confessed. We're not letting her slip away. The sheriff moved toward him. Put your rifles down. No, Sheriff, the man growled. You put yours down. Fairwater protects its own. Silas cackled in his cell. Hear that, Sheriff? The town knows the truth. But something else moved through the crowd. A deeper murmur, building like thunder. Then the sheriff heard it. A woman near the front said, I don't think the girl's lying. Another muttered, Dunn boys were never right. A man whispered, everyone knew Silas was cruel. A third murmured, maybe she did what nobody else dared. The sheriff looked again at the gallows. It wasn't a symbol of justice. It was a question. Fairwater was split, and the wind shifted. Suddenly, Eleanor Dunn's sister pushed through the crowd, pale, trembling, eyes red. My nephew is still alive, she cried. He's in agony. You want justice? Find who poisoned him. She did, someone shouted. No, the woman said, voice cracking. Silas told Eleanor months ago he planned to teach her obedience with tonic, something that would keep her weak. She swallowed hard. Now I think he was poisoning her long before Mariah ever touched the cellar. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The sheriff's breath caught. Silas shrieked from inside his cell. Liar! But it was too late. Truth had shifted. The crowd's certainty began collapsing under its own weight. And that was when Dr. Colling rode up at full speed, hat askew, coat flapping. He leapt from his horse. Sheriff, you must hear me. Nathaniel is dead. A silence cracked the air. And Eleanor, the doctor whispered. She passed moments ago. Silas's scream shattered the stillness. Mariah closed her eyes. The sheriff steadied himself. What killed them, doctor? Was it the girl's poison? Dr. Colling hesitated. No, he said. It wasn't her doses. She used small amounts. What killed them last night? He swallowed. It was a concentrated dose, far stronger. Silas went rigid. The doctor continued, voice trembling. It was added after Mariah was already in custody. The sheriff's stomach dropped. After she was arrested, he whispered. Yes, the doctor said. Someone dosed Nathaniel and Eleanor again. Someone who had access to the house. Every eye in the town turned toward the only surviving adult remaining in that house last night. Silas Dunn. The sheriff looked slowly toward the cell window. Silas was standing perfectly still, white as ash. Eyes wide with a terror no poisoning victim had ever known. No, Silas whispered. No, no, no. The sheriff stepped closer to the bars. Silas, did you poison them? Silas shook his head violently. She cursed the house. Silas, the sheriff said, voice low. Did you poison your own family? Silas collapsed to his knees and whispered, I only meant to make them quiet. A horrified gasp rose from the crowd. The sheriff closed his eyes. Mariah opened hers. The truth was no longer tangled. It stood naked before the entire town. Silas had poisoned his wife and son. Mariah had poisoned them too, but for very different reasons. The magistrate exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Sheriff, clear the crowd. I need time to... No, Sheriff Kellard interrupted, stepping forward as though he'd made a decision born from something deeper than duty. Hear me now. The town fell into uneasy silence. Fairwater, he called. The Dunn house carried evil, but not the kind you think. His eyes swept over the crowd and rested on Silas Dunn. There were 2 poisons in that home, the sheriff said. One was arsenic. He pointed to Silas. The other was him. The crowd rustled. Men lowered their rifles. Women clutched their children. The sheriff turned toward Mariah, still seated behind iron bars. And this girl, he said carefully, is not the evil you fear. She's the reason the Dunn horrors are known at all. Mariah bowed her head. Silas screamed, She killed them! The sheriff faced him. No, he said quietly. You killed them. You started this long before she touched your well. Then he turned to the magistrate. Hartwell, he said firmly, I request the following. Silas Dunn is to be charged with murder, assault, unlawful imprisonment, and attempted homicide. He paused. Mariah Dunn is to be charged with attempted poisoning. The magistrate stared. Sheriff, do you realize the uproar? I know exactly what it will cause, Kellard replied. Then he looked toward the crowd. And I know exactly what is right. Silas's knees buckled, exploding into guttural sobs. Mariah remained quietly seated. The sky lightened gently above them, showing the first thin streaks of dawn. But it did not feel like morning. It felt like judgment. And Fairwater would never be the same. The courthouse emptied slowly that morning, not because the crowd wished to leave, but because the building itself seemed to reject the fevered mass of bodies pressing against its walls. People stepped back into the muddy streets of Fairwater with murmurs in their throats, murmurs that sounded less like words and more like the rumbling of distant thunder. Some looked shaken, some confused. A few stared hollow-eyed at the Dunn estate far beyond the trees, as though waiting for ghosts to drift out of it. But none of them, none, walked away with certainty. Inside, the sheriff closed the courthouse doors with a heavy exhale, the old hinges groaning in protest. The morning light filtering through the dust-streaked windows caught the severity in his features. He wasn't a man built for spectacle. He was built for quiet law, for paperwork and neighborly disputes, not the unraveling of a family that had once controlled the entire valley. Deputy Miller approached cautiously. Sheriff? The crowd's dispersing, but not by much. They're hanging around the green, waiting. They're waiting for blood, Sheriff Kellard muttered. But they won't get it today, not from my hand. Sir, Miller whispered, They'll want answers before sundown. The sheriff closed his eyes briefly. Then we'll give them truth, whatever that costs. In the holding cells, Mariah sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. When the sheriff returned, she looked up, not with fear, not with hope, but with the quiet expectation of someone who already accepted the worst the world had to offer. "Mariah," he said, unlocking the outer gate, "you need to come with me." She rose immediately. "Yes, sir." Silas Dunn screamed from the next cell. He pounded the bars so hard his knuckles split, streaking the metal with red. "Sheriff, you're not taking her anywhere without taking me too. You think you'll silence me? You think you'll let her spin her devil's webs?" Sheriff Kellard slammed his fist into the bars, rattling them violently. "Silas, be silent." Silas snarled like an animal, breath ragged, eyes wild. Mariah did not look at him. She followed the sheriff past the cells, past the courthouse steps, past the cracked walkway where local children once dragged sticks. They emerged into the early morning air. The sheriff walked with her toward the back of the building, away from the crowd, away from Silas's screams. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. "Somewhere we can speak," the sheriff muttered. He opened the door of a small storage room behind the courthouse, a room lined with old crates, dried lantern oil, and the ghostly scent of mildew. A single lantern hung overhead. He closed the door behind them. For a moment he just stood there, hand against the wood, chest rising and falling in slow, heavy breaths. Then he turned to her. "I need to know," he said. "Everything." Mariah nodded once. "I've told you what happened." "That's not everything?" A quiet settled between them. Not hostile, not oppressive. Just waiting. Finally, Mariah stepped closer to the lantern, its glow softening the shadows along her cheek. "You want to know why I didn't stop?" "I want to know the truth," the sheriff answered. Mariah inhaled deeply. "When Eleanor started dying," she whispered, "I sat with her. When Silas wasn't watching, I washed her face, cooled her skin. Her voice trembled. I told her things I never said aloud. I confessed what I had done." The sheriff stiffened. "You told her?" Mariah nodded. "What did she say?" Tears welled in Mariah's eyes, not falling, just shimmering, held tightly by gravity or grief. She said, "Mariah, I knew." The sheriff's breath caught. "She knew," he whispered. "How?" Mariah's voice was barely a breath. "She said she knew long before the sickness. She knew I was breaking. She knew her husband had crushed me. She knew Nathaniel hurt me. She said she prayed God would give her courage to help me." A tear slipped free, but she said she never found it. Mariah wiped the tear away with her thumb. "She told me she was ashamed." The sheriff leaned heavily against a crate. "Lord help us," Mariah continued, voice trembling. "She said she wished she had taken me away from that house years ago. She said she wished she had fought him." "What did you say?" the sheriff asked quietly. "I told her it wasn't her fault. I told her I forgave her." "And did you?" Mariah closed her eyes. "Yes." The sheriff swallowed hard. "Then why did you keep poisoning the house?" Mariah's shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in exhaustion so deep it seemed carried in her bones. "Because I thought it was the only way to end it. I thought if I weakened them long enough, someone in town would finally look, ask questions, come inside the house." Her voice broke. "But no one did. For years, no one cared." "And now?" the sheriff asked. Mariah's eyes opened. They glistened in the lantern light. "Now it's too late." The sheriff took a step forward. "Mariah, Eleanor forgave you, and the law?" "The law doesn't forgive," she interrupted. "The law counts." The sheriff opened his mouth to speak, but a sharp knock at the outer door cut him off. Deputy Halford burst in, face pale as moonlight. "Sheriff, you need to come out front, now!" The sheriff cursed under his breath and hurried outside, Mariah at his heels. What he saw on the courthouse green pulled the breath from his lungs. Dozens of people stood clustered in a tight circle. Their expressions ranged from grim determination to blank horror, and their voices filled the cold morning air with low, feverish whispers. In the center of the circle stood Doctor, calling, coat soaked with sweat, spectacles slipping down his nose. He held a piece of paper in his trembling hand. "What is it?" the sheriff demanded. The doctor's mouth opened and closed twice before he finally found his voice. "It's a note," he whispered. "I found it, in Nathaniel's room, under his mattress." The sheriff frowned. Note from who?" The doctor turned the paper over, revealing the writing, harsh, jagged strokes, unmistakably masculine. "From Silas Dunn." A ripple of shock tore through the crowd. The sheriff snatched the note and read it aloud. "If she speaks, they'll believe her. She's been watching. I'll handle it. Tonight." Signed only with a crude S. A heavy silence settled over Fairwater. Then a woman in the crowd whispered, "He meant to kill her." Another voice rose. "He tried." A third murmured, "Maybe she was right all along." And then the crowd turned, slowly, painfully, toward the courthouse window ward, where Silas Dunn sat in his cell. He stared back with an expression that curdled into something ugly. "Sheriff," Dr. Colling whispered, "that note, it proves intent, malice. He planned to murder her before she ever poisoned anyone." "More than that," the sheriff murmured. "It proves the Dunn house was a battlefield long before she ever touched the arsenic." The crowd's murmur swelled into something darker, anger twisted with revelation. Silas screamed and threw himself at the bars. "Lies, all lies. You think a scrap of paper—" His voice cracked. He dissolved into guttural sobs. Mariah watched him quietly. The sheriff looked at her. "Do you see what this means?" She shook her head slowly. "Mariah," he whispered, "this note changes everything. It means he's guilty of premeditation. It means your fear wasn't imagined. It means—" "It means nothing," she murmured. "It won't bring them back." "Bring who back?" Mariah's breath trembled. "Eleanor, Thomas." The sheriff opened his mouth but stopped, because something had changed in Mariah's face. A stillness. A resignation. The crowd shifted uneasily. Then, from the far side of the green, a voice rose. A voice that cut through the cold like a blade. "She should be released." Heads turned. Eleanor's sister stood tall, cloak whipping in the wind. "Release her," she cried. "Mariah tried to stop a wicked man the only way she could." Others joined. "She's the survivor. She's the victim. She deserves mercy." But then came opposing voices. "She poisoned a family. She killed them. She deserves the rope." The sheriff raised his hands. "Enough. The magistrate will—" But Magistrate Hartwell stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "No," he said. "This doesn't wait for a full court. The town demands a resolution now." A hush fell. Hartwell turned to Mariah. "You stand accused of poisoning the Dunn family. Half lie dead, the rest are dying." Silas shrieked, "Convict her!" The magistrate ignored him. "Mariah," Hartwell said, "given the evidence, I must ask, do you regret your actions?" Silence. Then, "Yes." The word was soft. "Broken, but genuine. Do you seek forgiveness?" Hartwell asked. Mariah's voice cracked. "I seek peace." The magistrate exhaled. "Then I will deliver judgment." The sheriff swallowed, sudden dread rising like bile. Hartwell stepped forward. "Mariah Dunn," he declared. "For the attempted poisoning of the Dunn household, this court sentences you to—" "Stop." Everyone turned. Reverend Hayes pushed through the crowd, panting, face flushed. "You cannot sentence her," he gasped. "And why not?" Hartwell demanded. Reverend Hayes pointed a shaking finger toward Silas. "Because she is not the evil of that house. He is." Hartwell stiffened. Hayes raised his Bible. "And because last night, before she died, Eleanor Dunn made a confession." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "What confession?" the sheriff demanded. Reverend Hayes took a deep breath. "She said the household had been poisoned, long before Mariah ever touched a jar." Hartwell frowned. "Explain." Hayes whispered. "Silas kept his family weak. He dosed them regularly, in tea, in medicine, in tonic, so they stayed obedient." Silas screamed, "Lies!" Hayes continued, voice steadying. "And Eleanor, she died with that truth on her tongue." The sheriff closed his eyes. Mariah's breath caught. The magistrate staggered back a step. "You mean to say—" Dr. Colling stepped forward. "I confirm it. I examined Silas's medicine cabinet this morning, hidden under false boards, powdered arsenic, much larger quantities than Mariah ever used." Silas collapsed to his knees. The crowd erupted into horrified whispers. The sheriff steadied himself and raised his voice. "Then hear me now," he called. "Mariah was trapped in a house of poison, a house ruled by a murderer, a house where her only choices were silence or survival." Hartwell bowed his head, then lifted his gaze. "Mariah Dunn," he said softly. "The law would demand punishment." Mariah nodded. "But justice," he continued, "demands mercy." The sheriff's heart clenched. The crowd went still as frost. "Therefore," Hartwell declared, "Mariah Dunn is hereby absolved of murder charges. She will stand only for attempted poisoning, and given the conditions of her imprisonment, the abuse she endured, and the evidence of coercion, her sentence is time served." A stunned silence swept the green. Then voices rose, some in outrage, some in relief, some in awe. Mariah stood trembling, unable to breathe. The sheriff stepped toward her and unlocked her cuffs. "You're free," he whispered. Mariah inhaled sharply, a broken, disbelieving sound. Silas screamed from his cell. "No, she's mine. She belongs to me. You can't take her away." Mariah looked at him for the first time. Really looked. Then she whispered, "I was never yours." Silas smashed his fists against the bars until bone cracked. Hartwell nodded to the sheriff. "Take him to Jackson for trial." The crowd parted as deputies dragged Silas Dunn from the courthouse, kicking, screaming, bleeding, cursing every soul in Fairwater. Mariah watched him go. The sheriff turned to her. "What now?" he asked. Mariah wiped a tear from her cheek. "I go somewhere he can't follow." "Where is that?" She looked at the rising sun. "I don't know, but it isn't here." The sheriff nodded. "Then you'll have a horse and safe passage." Mariah bowed her head. "Thank you." As the town watched, she stepped away from the courthouse, quiet, small, but unbroken. The crowd parted around her. Some bowed their heads. Some stepped back in fear. Some whispered prayers. By the time the sun rose fully, Mariah Dunn had vanished into the mist rolling over the fields. Fairwater would never see her again, but it would never forget her. And the Dunn house, rotting, poisoned, cursed by its own master, stood empty on the hill, a monument to everything hidden behind closed doors. So what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled or buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story.